Good evening, afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Higgs. I'm the director of White Columns, and it's great to be on this Zoom broadcast, which is being hosted by Gordon Robichaux Gallery on the occasion of a truly wonderful exhibition of works by Caroline Go, which is on view in New York City until June the 25th. So if you haven't had a chance to see it yet, I encourage you to do so. And I'm going to moderate this afternoon's conversation, which is between two important people in the unfolding narrative of Caroline Go's life and work. And they are Lynne Tillman and Agosto Machado. And I'll just very briefly give bios for both of them before we start the conversation proper. So I'll introduce Lynne Tillman first. Lynne Tillman's a novelist, short story writer, and cultural critic based in New York. Her book-length autobiographical essay, Mothercare, about caring for her ailing mother for 11 years, was published in 2022. Tillman's most recent novel, Men and Apparitions, was published in 2018 by Soft Skull Press, and a new edition of her 2006 novel, American Genius, a comedy, was published by the Soft Skull Press in 2019. Tillman writes regularly on art and culture in museum catalogs, artist books, and journals such as Aperture and Frieze. Caroline Go, the exhibition Caroline Go, works from the collection of Lynne Tillman, took place at White Columns in 2019, and we'll come to that later. I'll now introduce Agosto Machado. Agosto Machado is a Chinese, Spanish, Filipino, American performance artist, activist, archivist, muse, caretaker, and friend to countless celebrated and underground visual and performing artists. He's been a vital participant and witness to cultural creative life in New York since the early 60s, from art, theater, performance, and film to social and political counterculture and the dawn of the gay liberation movement. Caroline Go was included in Agosto Machado, The Forbidden City, a wonderful exhibition at Gordon Robichaux of Machado's collections of artwork and ephemera that was in 2022 and subsequently led to the current exhibition of Caroline Go's works at Gordon Robichaux, which are all drawn from the personal collection of Agosto. My name is Matthew Higgs, as I mentioned before. I'm the director of White Columns. And in relation to this afternoon's conversation, White Columns hosted in 2019 what at the time we believed to be the first exhibition of Caroline Go's work, all drawn from the personal collection of Lynne Tillman. So by way of a beginning, I thought, both Lynne and Agosto, perhaps the easiest way to set the stage, so to speak, for the conversation is for each of you just to speak to your experiences, your encounters with Caroline Go, and we'll take it from there. So perhaps I'd like to invite Lynne to speak to that first.
Thank you, and what a pleasure to find out that there are over 200 works of Caroline Go's extant and that people have them. That's fantastic. I was trying to remember, Matthew, before I talk about encountering Caroline Go, how it happened that we did the exhibition. I believe I was at White Columns and mentioned or talked to you about having this work by a so-called outsider artist. Or did I bring the work with me to show you? Maybe I brought it with me to show you.
No, well, my memory of that, Lynne, is you just telling me about it. And in your extremely convincing way, I was immediately hooked. So that without seeing the work, I probably agreed to do the show, and was clearly pleasantly surprised and rewarded when I actually saw the works themselves. But to me, at least, the story that unfolded that you told me seemed just incredibly intriguing. It sounded like a short story one might read in fiction, or something one might encounter in a film. It seemed very unlikely, yet it turned out to be entirely true. And not only true, but obviously as more and more people come to the fore who had these encounters with Caroline Go, it seems to me that there's a really substantial narrative here that was missing or was obscured from New York's cultural life in the 1980s. So that's my memory of how the White Column show came about, but it was very organic.
The way in which I collected her work, although I didn't think of myself as a collector, of course, sometime in the 80s, I think it was the mid 80s, perhaps it was the early 80s. And as I recall, I believe it was on 3rd Avenue, but it could have been 2nd Avenue, that I would find her. And she would generally be sitting either on a small chair. I don't remember her sitting on she would have a blanket spread out. And I don't remember her sitting on the blanket. I believe she was always sitting kind of above it. So she must have had a stool. And on the blanket was an array of her work. And I have to say, I was immediately gobsmacked because the colors, first you're drawn in, I think. You don't actually see the figures or the objects. I was drawn in by the colors. There was this incredible array of colors. And there was also different kinds of materials that she used. There were cut up pieces of fabric. I remember a kind of black satin that she would paint on. There were fragments from a canvas that you thought perhaps she had cut up. And she was charging, I think, just $1 or sometimes maybe $2 a picture. And I remember just grabbing a bunch or choosing, perhaps 4. And I think one of the things, and this is interesting in that divide about what is art, if anyone ever thinks about that anymore, not that one does have to, but this work was, to me, very sophisticated and very purposeful. And she would make a flower. I think one of the pieces I have is a flower that was so beautifully painted on a black satin cloth, a small piece of fabric. And then there would be such uncanny kinds of images, one of which I gave to a friend of mine, where the telephone is involved, and it's like the connection of the wire is between different people. It was a wonderfully humorous and also serious commentary on communication. She also used to like to paint a lot of nuns. So I guess I assumed she was Catholic or had gone to Catholic school or just liked nuns the way many people are fascinated with nuns. And I saw her there. Every time I saw her there, I would buy something. And of course, I thought she must have no money. And it was so inexpensive. I didn't have a lot of money at that time, but I thought, more than she did, that's for sure. I had a job as a proofreader, I think, at that point. So every time I saw her, I bought something, and then she disappeared. I may not, of course, I didn't see her every time she was out on the sidewalk, but I tried to buy something from her every time I saw her. And then she disappeared. I didn't know what happened.
Before I ask Agosto to respond, Lynn, could you perhaps describe Carolyn Go at this time? This is almost 40 years ago.
She was small. It was hard to tell what shape she was because as she was outside, she was usually wearing something draped over her. She had blondish hair, as I recall. I'm trying to remember if she wore glasses. I don't think she did wear glasses. She didn't really greet me or at least I can only speak for myself. I would come to where she was, and I'd say, oh, I would like this and this and this, and I would just give her the money. I don't think there was any exchange, but that's how I remember her, as small, kind of dirty blonde hair, not dirty, but just the color wasn't blonde. And she didn't speak. She didn't speak to me anyway. Sometimes she would say thank you. And I almost felt, it's a very curious thing. You feel when you give an artist so little money. I think I felt not guilty or something, but I didn't feel good about it. There was the exchange was not equal in that sense, not equal to her talent. And it did raise the question I was going to say about art, about why was she not in a gallery? This work was maybe odd, but in some ways, but it was painted so wonderfully. So it was a curious encounter with her. It was not entirely pleasant, even though I walked away with beautiful images, but it wasn't pleasant because here was this woman, maybe she was in her late 30s or 40s, who was selling her work for $1 or $2. It was, I think, uncomfortable.
Thanks, Lynn. Agosto, the same to you, really. If you can say something about your encounters with Caroline and then your subsequent, acquiring her work and what we can now see at Gordon Robichaux is this really extraordinary collection of objects.
Well, there's such a mystique about her. And as Lynn has mentioned, there wasn't a conversation as such. And I encountered, put it in a context, in that part of the 80s, people used to sell their things on the sidewalk and even sometimes on 2nd Avenue across St. Mark's or behind Cooper Union. They would call it the Thieves' Market because it was a great deal of crime or scavengers. And amid all this was Caroline minimally just putting her work on the sidewalk or a blanket and very modestly, without any attention and no conversations. And everything I purchased was for $1. But the works just spoke to me, the immediacy, the colors, the various objects she painted on. And that, she was so remarkable. I told my friends I'm from the La Mama's art circle. And people said, oh, but there's so many outsider artists. And I'm a very close friend of Thomas Lanigan Smith, who's of that sort of circle who does their own artwork. But for Caroline, I mainly found her behind Cooper Union. There's a little triangle park where Peter Cooper's statue is, and there's a breezeway from 7th Street, and then it crosses into behind the school. But she and other artists were selling their art, and the contrast of what was for sale in the neighborhood is Caroline's work was art. It wasn't found objects that people were selling, or clothing, or utensils, or plates and bric-a-brac. And she, I felt, didn't have to stand too long. She did have shopping bags sometimes. And as soon as something was sold, she'd bring some more out of the shopping bag. But also with this mystery, after a while, she had 2 young children with her. And I never learned anything about them. The only thing, when I used to come regularly, it was on my footpath. I lived on 4th Street in Bowery and would cross up to Cooper's Square and that area. And she would be there mainly on the weekends for me. And there were times she kept her eye up on the children. And when the young boy, 8 or 9, would say, "Oh, collector." And then Caroline would turn and see me, and she would put her hand out, and I'd see all this array. And yes, I did use food money, and so, but it was only $1 a piece, and I was very fortunate to get pieces on wood, on fabric, and anything she could get her hands on. It's a thorough delight, and I'm so pleased that that the attention that White Collins, Lynne, Gordon Robichaux has shown her the respect. And now with this, she is a magnet. And it's so delightful that more people are acknowledging her and recognizing her for the pure artist she is.
And Agosto, like with Lynne, did you engage in conversation with her, or did she engage in conversation with you?
No, there wasn't real conversation. It was sort of silent, but the recognition, she would look at people who looked at her work and what you selected. And I think Lynne responds to certain things, and I do. And she sort of clocked what was in the most popular of her work, which was the caps and the mysterious women, the religious work. And she truly was so prolific. It does my heart so good to know there are 200 works, there could be 500 works. She was so prolific. And the mystique and mystery is somewhere in the late 80s, early 90s, she disappeared. And people were saying perhaps human services or sort of relocated her children to a different borough. But we didn't know the circumstances. We knew she lived in Alphabet Land because I'd seen her without disturbing her, scavenging through the garbage. And I think a lot of us used to look through the garbage because all my furniture is recycled from the street. And so it was culturally what we were doing economically and prolifically.
I mean,
I had one more thought about her not speaking. I don't know if you felt this also, but I think her not speaking was a form of dignity. I think that she was in a position that was, not the way people usually want to sell their art, not hanging on a wall. And I think she rectified that in a way by having a very, she wasn't there to engage with you. She wasn't trying to woo you or win you or show you what a great personality she had, or there was her art, and that was the exchange. And I think I thought then that she carried herself with a lot of dignity.
Perhaps both, this question is to both of you, or this, this thought is to both of you, that where this was happening, ultimately, I think is quite significant. I'm not American and I wasn't part of the downtown New York art scene in the 1980s, but Caroline Go was selling her work in the East Village, a pretty extraordinary, now mythologized time for the cultural life of this city. There were a lot of galleries in the East Village. There were a lot of artists living there. There were studios, there were bars, there were clubs. I mean, it seems not a coincidence that Caroline Go perhaps understood there was a context and an audience, potential audience, for her work in this milieu at that time. I mean, as certainly as we've learned who subsequently acquired works from her, which we'll come to later, it's a lot of people who are connected to the art world. So it's almost as if she knew exactly what she was doing. Lynne.
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't put it together like that, but she was in a context of which, of course, she was aware, and people would be somehow, not everyone, but many, involved with art or writing, as I was both. And you would notice, you would notice she wasn't in 42nd Street subway station, putting her wares on. That would not give her a kind of immediate audience. I think you're right, Matthew. I think she had art training too, didn't she? Or am I mistaken?
I'm not familiar with that information, but I know that since we did the show at White
Not
Columns
at
in
all?
2019,
No.
a lot more
Oh,
information
it's-
has come to the fore.
Uh-huh.
But the work suggests she had art training to me. I mean, it doesn't have the classic kind of aura of self-taught art.
Mhm. Was that, who was it? Henry, the one who made little armies of women and
Henry Gardner.
yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, I'm far from an expert on so-called outsider art. I remember when the fairs began, and I remember that his work became very famous, or very well known, and had a show. Was he the first so-called outsider artist that everybody seemed to be talking about? Was this the 80s?
Well, I mean, his work certainly once it became public, garnered immediate recognition on on a scale that was probably unprecedented at that time.
Yeah, no. I'm just wondering if she wasn't also, awareness of her
Right.
was also part of a more general awareness of these artists who may not have gone to art school or did not have the same trajectory.
And Augusta, how would you think about Caroline Go with selling her work on the street in the East Village within the larger context of what was happening in the East Village at that time?
Well, I think you're right, Matthew, about the milieu of what was happening economically, and how people saw, well, they're selling this, I'll sell this. But there were other artists, Mickey Perez, who's in the American Folk Museum. I bought some of his things. He was a super on Fifth Street and Bowery, and he used house paint and pieces of wood or canvas, whatever he found, to do his animals. And so, and then later, Sur Shadow, who lived at the last remaining Bowery Hotel, which just closed within the last year. And he lived there, but he was the last tenant, and he lived in a wheelchair, so he lived on the first floor, reception lobby, what have you. And he used to pin his work in Washington Square Park, but the Parks people didn't want him there, and eventually he stopped doing that. But his work is so immediate and magical. I hope he's on the gadget so people could look him up. But the immediacy of his work is in the clarity, and I imagine with Caroline Goes is the inspiration of the art to be expressed had to pour out immediately, and each artist in his own way expressed with the colors and what is available. He mainly used on black paper or on against a wall or where billboards were, what have you. But there's a continuity of outsider's art that, like, if we can look at Thomas Lanigan Smith's work, and I do encourage people to look him up, he comes from very poor economic circumstances, and he used what was available: pipe cleaners, tinsel, saran wrap, glitter, and what have you. And to this day, consistently, that's what he uses. It's available. Tinfoil, anything that is available, he could make art. And of course, he's famous for his famous golden tinfoil wraps that he got. He bought things, the tinfoil, in the floral district, and he would buy in volumes. And so each in their own way, I've sort of filled in the stories of the artists who were filling in. And I think Lynne has seen various artists too, even photographers who were selling snapshots, something that meant something to them that they wanted to express and share. It wasn't about money. None of the people were about money. It was about actually sharing their art and their lives. It is so personal. It's very moving.
I mean, one of the things that fascinates me and is becoming increasingly interesting as more information is known about Caroline Go, her work, but also the people that supported her work and collected her work at that time, is this relationship to the individuals who acquired the work. So when we did the exhibition at White Columns, all of those works were drawn from Lynne Tillman's collection. And the current exhibition at Gordon Robichaux, all of the works are drawn from Agosto's collection. So we get this amazing opportunity to think about Caroline Go through the lens of our understanding of Lynne and Lynne's work, or Agosto and Agosto's work and life. And what's happened since, just to the viewers on today's broadcast, is that a really large number, a growing number of people have come forward to say that they also have significant holdings of Caroline Go's work. And that includes Carol Squires, who I believe on one day bought everything that was on the blanket. So Carol Squires' group of works is everything that was available on a single day. So it's really a remarkable snapshot of what Caroline Go was thinking about around that time, because she acquired everything that was available. But then also someone like Peter Acheson, who's on this call, I believe has more than 100 works. Brett De Palma, I also believe, has more than 100 works. The artist Chris Martin, although I think he lost some in a studio flood. Paul Laster and Rene Ricardo are also on this call, I believe, have something in the region of 40 works. And Robin Winters, and we assume others. So I think what seems amazing about this is that it's an unfolding work in progress. And I think it would obviously make an incredible documentary if someone had the wherewithal to not just do the oral histories of everybody who encountered Caroline Go, but also this very kind of personal relationship these individuals have with the objects they acquired. So what I'd like to just ask both Agosto and Lynne is, maybe Lynne first. When we organized the exhibition at White Columns, which was 4 years ago, but it seems like an eternity now given the pandemic. I'll just read a paragraph from the press release as a sort of prelude. This is from the press release from the show we did at White Columns. It says, "Almost nothing is known about Caroline Go's life, or indeed whether she is still alive," and we didn't know that. What is known is that Go sold her paintings on the streets of New York's East Village in the 1980s, and that her work attracted the attention of a number of artists and writers, including Lynne, Chris Martin, Robin Winters, among others. This exhibition, and at the time we believed it was the first dedicated to Go's work, comprises all of the paintings that Tillman acquired from the artist from the mid-80s to the early 1990s. And then Lynne goes on to talk about her relationship with that. But I wondered if you could both speak to the group of works that you acquired. And one thing that really intrigues me is that you both, and everybody else that acquired her work, chose to save it and preserve them in remarkably amazing condition. So one might think that works that were bought on the street for $1 might be somewhat disposable. But it seems to me in every case that the people who acquired works from Caroline Go very respectfully looked after those works for now 4 decades. And that we're in this extraordinary position to see these works anew. So perhaps, Lynne, when we did the exhibition at White Columns, did you have a thought about your collection and what it meant seeing them together?
Well, without you, of course, Matthew, that wouldn't have happened. Your willingness at White Columns to show work that has never been shown before, or hasn't been shown in New York or is wonderful. It's what's so marvelous about White Columns is its openness to this kind of work that may not sell well or something. Seeing it all on a wall, it's so interesting, isn't it? When you see something on a wall as compared to in a box, or it gives it a distinction. I thought the work was wonderful and amazing and strange, and there's no way I would have ever thrown anything out. I still feel badly that I gave away one of them. But you knew they were special. They were special. There was a special mind behind this, and the mystery of who she was and why she was doing what she did, not why she was painting. She was obviously very talented. She knew she had talent. And she was very prolific. But the 70s in New York, I came back from living in Europe in the later 70s, but the city was in terrible trouble and financial ruin, and the Lower East Side or the East Village was still quite cheap to live in. I guess by the late 80s began to change, going, of course, into the 90s, and the art world was also changing too. But I can't imagine anyone throwing out that work. I mean, if you were lucky to have seen her, you were lucky to have been able to buy some, I think.
And Agosto, how do you feel now seeing the works that you acquired over a number of years together and presented at Gordon Robichaux?
Well, I mean, I personally responded to all the pieces, and I did give a few of the wonderful pieces through the years, and maybe like Lynne is giving this priceless, wonderful gift, and the people didn't respond in the way I thought they would. They were so respectful, and giving is an act in itself. But then I got more cautious, and it seemed very possessive, but I wasn't hoarding them, but I felt like maybe we were protecting it and honoring it, not only the work, but the artist. And one day it should be appreciated. And thank goodness White Columns did, and Gordon Robichaux Gallery has refined the collection I have and given attention. And so the book you're going to do, I'm so happy that there's going to be maybe 200-300 works. And I don't want to be the curator because the range of the work, my goodness, I mean, it breaks your heart. There's not enough pages. Even if you had 500 pages in this art book and you couldn't lift it, and she deserves, all the work deserves the respect and attention.
Well, I think one of the ideas for the book, Agosto, is that it will be organized around these very personal collections that people have. So rather than trying to organize the work thematically or trying to guess at its chronology, it's really to organize it as groups of works that are acquired by a specific individual or individuals, and then allow a kind of oral history component to come in where those individuals can speak to their relationship with Caroline Go and the work. And I think what's been incredibly rewarding, obviously we love doing the exhibition at White Columns with Lynne, and but what's been really rewarding is all these other people that are now coming forward with their stories about Caroline Go. I think we're learning a little bit more about her life, and the children that you saw, Augusta, where they're on the street are now obviously adults, and there's more work. And I think as the story gains visibility, I think we'll find that there are many other people too who also have work. So I think when Sam introduced this, he said there were some 200 plus works. I think it's already considerably more than that, and that alone, I think it's remarkable that much of the work has survived. But it's clear, or it seems evident to me, that there's more. one question I wanted to ask both of you, and perhaps, Lynne as a writer first, the character of Caroline Go, if she was a character, she was obviously a real person, but the sort of idea of Caroline Go is incredibly fascinating to me. And the fact that, when we did our exhibition 4 years ago, we knew almost nothing about her or subsequent life. Now we know a little bit more about her and her subsequent life, but there's still a great deal missing. And I would imagine, at least to a writer, Caroline Go presents herself as an potentially incredible subject.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You could base a character. I've based characters on far less. A person passing me in the street whose face had a certain expression. And her silence, of course, is a wonderful place to begin to invent a character. All the unspokenness of it, those exchanges without words, they're fascinating to find words for them.
And Agosto, I mean, how would, if someone asked you to characterize Caroline Go, I mean, how would you approach that?
Well, part of the mystique was she did, there wasn't a conversation. She spoke with her art, and she could look at you and what she chose. But that reticence, it spoke volumes and was very touching. Is that here's this woman who later I mentioned the two children, and when my boy said, "Oh, collector," and I had $3 or $4, she'd give them the money, and they could go to the bodega to get a soda and chips, and that's made them happy, and they could sit in the park and do this. But I don't know about Lynne, but she wasn't out. She was there often on the street selling, but she wasn't there for lengthy hours, because her work would respond to people, and people would love it and purchase them.
I mean, and it's also conceivable, even though, the works were priced at $1 or $2, that, if, like, when Carol Squires came across her and bought everything she had that day, she may have made $20 in, a few minutes.
Happy though. It was food money.
Before we open this up to other people on the call, because I know that there's some great people involved on this call who also had encounters with Caroline Go, I just wanted to perhaps close our part of the conversation now on the kind of language that we might try to apply to a figure like Caroline Go, because I think, that it's conceivable that, she might fall under the umbrella term outsider artist, or, perhaps Lynne Cook's more interesting rethinking of that, an outlier artist. But it seems to me that she's such a potentially complex individual and complex maker that perhaps some of those kind of boxes that we try to put a lot of the work of what we assume is self-taught art into never quite work or never quite fit. So I was just curious about, before we open this up, your thoughts around, the idea of Caroline Go as an outsider artist, an outlier, a maverick. Are those terms useful here?
Well, they go first.
Oh, I think there is an institutional definition of art that once you put it in a gallery, it's art. I mean, that's obviously what Duchamp did. And so she's an artist. The more her work is in galleries or perhaps someday museums, the less that question could be asked. I think outlier is a good term. That Lynne Cook's term is a good one. But, I'm struck that people didn't receive the works that well when you gave them. And I think it's because it didn't have the imprimatur of this is an artist this is an artwork that you're getting, not some kind of strange little thing. And the question of naming, then, Matthew, is very important. And we all struggle with that. Whatever field or whatever terms we use about people, obviously we're in a kind of storm of changing names now and all of that. So that's disappointing that people didn't receive the works with more admiration, I guess.
I think one of the things that's very interesting to me is that the majority of the works that I've seen are signed, you know, their initial CG.
Yeah.
There was a very conscious decision on her part to, you know, to author these works. And I think the other thing that's interesting to me is, you know, that when Agosto mentioned that he gifted some and they weren't necessarily as appreciated as much as Agosto had, one of the things that I think is important, for me at least, is that the more of the work you see, the more of you start to understand or gain an understanding of her obsessive relationship with making. Because, you know, the fact that there are several hundred of these works that we know, and the fact that she worked through certain subject matter routinely and regularly, I think is when you start to see this sort of obsessive compulsive. That's where I think people might start to sort of align it with, you know, some of the kind of classic tropes of outsider art. But my feeling is that hopefully, you know, the more we learn about her story and her narrative and her biography, I feel this, you know, a documentary would be a perfect form for this, some kind of like detective documentary, to really kind of get to the kind of core of what Caroline Go was up to. Because, you know, Lynne, you also mentioned that, you know, once a work enters the kind of frame of the gallery, it becomes art. What seems very interesting to me is, unless, you know, the Gracie Mansion is true that she had a show during her lifetime, Caroline Go's work never entered the frame of the gallery on art. You know, it was a blanket on the sidewalk, and therefore shares much closer with the kind of improvised flea markets that Agosto spoke of in, you know, behind Cooper Square. So I would like to thank both of you for meeting Caroline Go, for supporting her work, for protecting and keeping her work, and then for being in a position to share it with the rest of us. And, you know, White Columns is greatly excited about making a book about Caroline Go's life and work, which is forthcoming. And I would now, with Sam at Gordon Robichaux, who's hosting this call, I think can unmute things, we'd be very happy to not so much take questions, but commentary or observations or memories from anybody that's on the call. So again, thank you all for this part. And then if anybody would like to join in, feel free to put your hand up and speak. Yep, Paul Laster, we'll go to you first.
Hi. Rene and I are sitting here and remembering Caroline, which our thoughts are.
Could you guys, before you do this, could you guys introduce yourself for posterity?
Yeah, I'm Paul Laster. I started as an artist in the late 70s here in New York, and am currently and then as an artist and then as a curator, and then eventually I transitioned to being a writer, starting with ArtNet in the late 90s, and then am mostly a writer and a curator now, an art writer and a curator.
Mm-hmm. Rene?
And Rene Ricardo. I had a gallery, Arena, for a number of years, but previous to that, in the 80s, I worked at MoMA and then worked at Mo David Gallery on East 9th Street. And Paul and I used to go between the East Village and the West Village quite regularly. So that she was like right in the middle, Caroline. So we can tell you a little bit about that at some point, because that was kind of the spot that we would always cross between on St. Mark's and where the Cube was. That's how I remember where she was set up.
Yeah.
Like on you know, between 8th Street and St. Mark's.
I kind of remember it as like the spot where we, you know, famously the picture of David Hammond selling the snowballs. That's where we'd often encounter her with, and sometimes with her son, who would be selling comic books.
Yeah, and it's curious that you mentioned Robin Winters, because I worked at Mo David Gallery where Robin showed, and his work was a lot like Caroline's at the time, doing these kind of caricatures. And one of the shows that he did at Mo David was he created a cement floor with different pieces of cement floor, and the drawings were under the floor, so people had to lift the cement blocks to look at the drawings. So
yeah, they were like
interesting.
rocks.
Yeah,
made them like
it's a
rocks.
relationship to what Robin was doing at the time.
Yeah, in the sense that they were quickly done, Robin's were. That's what I thought about Caroline's too, was that, I think in hearing everybody's thoughts about her, I think that she probably saw that people were selling stuff on the street, and she may have seen that people were selling artworks on the street. And that might have motivated her with having the kids, as Agosto mentioned, like having a few dollars extra to give them some spending money. It might have motivated her to start making something. But what she made to me was very much like a visionary artist, in the sense that, to me, I remember conversations with her about different pieces. And she somehow, I keep coming back to these thoughts of like her talking about religion in relation to the pieces that we had chosen, a number of them. So it made me think, like, within that time too, the area was very much a Ukrainian area. I mean, that was one of the things too, of like Veselka and, the restaurants that we would go to when we went to the East Village to go to galleries. That maybe she had, I don't know, the name Carolyn Go almost sounds like she could be Irish, but it could have been a shortened name. And so she might have actually been Ukrainian, because a lot of the costumes of the artworks that we have were women. They seem
Embroidery.
Latin. Yeah, they seem like embroidered, but I mean, they could almost be Latin American, but they also seem very much like a Ukrainian kind of Easter costumes or something like that.
Or maybe she was looking at books of art.
Yeah.
And no one's mentioned really, but I mean a little bit. But she was right in front of Cooper Union, which is really interesting that she was right in front of this art school. I wonder if that was, other than people selling stuff on the street.
Yeah.
But it was, at that time, that point was sort of like 42nd Street. It's like everybody crossed that point in downtown. That was like the crossing point of, all East Village, West Village, uptown, downtown. It was a spot where, everybody would walk by. So there was a lot of traffic there.
And I
too.
think she did, like Agosto mentioned, or like you mentioned with Carol Squires, which is interesting to find out that she had acquired them, was that she did sell them rather quickly, probably. She didn't have to spend a lot of time there. And so she was motivated too to make a new batch. And I mean, her brushwork is very, very fast. And also too, I think it's so interesting that the show right now is paired with Tony Fayer, because Tony, I wrote about Tony and spoke with Tony many times. Tony would gather all of his materials from the street as well. And I remember once having a conversation with him about a show that I think it was a show at Brent Sycamores, where he went back to showing with Brent after being with Pace. And I said, it's like these works, like, where did you find this and where did you find that? He said, like, these materials that I've gathered, I couldn't make these works now because you can't find these kinds of things in the East Village, like on the street. So a lot of the works that we have too are, some are, they're on scraps of paper, they're on a piece of canvas that you can see that someone had painted on the other side of it. Like maybe she just found it thrown out. They're on like cardboard that was from products, like she cut it up and then painted on the other side of the plain unprinted side. So very much in that sense of like a gatherer, in the same way that Rauschenberg did in his early work, gathering things downtown, to find materials to work. And it's interesting what I think, I can't remember if Lynne or Agosto said that seeing Carolyn going through trash the same way like Basquiat did in the East Village in that time, going through the trash to find materials to work with. So she found this stuff, and then she'd like sometimes oddly cut it, like many of the ones we have, they're not cut in a square, they're just cut in like a strange type of shape. And then she would paint, though, the whole thing. Like there's one that we have of a vase with flowers in it, and it's just on a really oddly shaped piece of paper. but she painted a frame around it on three sides, you know. So
Yeah.
she you know, she had a sense of what art should be. But to me, a lot of it came from visions that were in her head, that she wasn't necessarily looking at something like a contemporary artist looking at a magazine, you know, or the internet to find source material. I think a lot of it came from like her religious beliefs, or her like having a cat, or like you know, remembering some ceremony at the church, or you know, something like that.
I think one of the last things, just briefly, you know, the idea of paying $1 for an artwork. I remember I remember more her work on the street than her herself, because I remember when Paul and I would go by that, I really, like Lynn was saying, felt really bad that you just give someone $1 for an artwork, but that's really what she was asking for. But it was also the time, like like most people have said here, nobody had any money really then. Even like, you know, Karen Finley used to call into Mo David and said there were rats in her apartment and she couldn't, you know, they were chewing up her phone or something. You know, it's like people, it's that sense of, you know, art not really having a very big price ticket on it, although things were changing in the East Village for artists who were starting to get notoriety. But really, no one really had much money. So to buy something for $1 was strange, but at the same time, not so unusual.
Yeah, we only bought a few over a period of a couple of years, probably. And in a sense, I always felt like too, that by buying works, it kept her supported, it kept her going, you know.
Okay.
Thanks for that, guys. Sir, would you like to jump in?
Oh, yes. I was going to say that Carolyn, there are invoices of sales of Carolyn Go's work through Gracie Mansion Gallery. She never had a show there, but Gracie did buy a number of works. I showed them to me and said, "Oh, this is really exciting. I want to do a show at this woman's work." I remember seeing it, and nothing ever happened. But I do know that there were a couple of pieces sold. It'd be interesting to see what they were sold for. But it was like,
Can I ask you when that was, sir? When was
this
that?
This would have been like 80, 81, 82.
All right.
Not as late as
I remember that she might have said to us that Gracie Mansion had like bought her work or sold her work or something like that. So I remember that story about Gracie at that time as well. Yeah.
And Gracie would have been the perfect person to do it. She would have turned into conceptual things. She would have given her a spot in front of the gallery to sell her work if she wanted, did something else inside. We would have had a lot of fun with it in the spirit. But I think that, you know, actually, you know, there were a lot of markets. People would put stuff out on the street to sell, to make money or change for that day. That was an open air market. Anyone that had an idea would go and do it, from David Hammonds to Carolyn Go to like someone selling something that they just ripped off from their neighbors and needed a change to get it. By drugs.
Like a chainsaw, somebody came to offer me one day at the gallery.
Yeah.
But not having ever met her and only seeing the work that Gracie presented, I remember them as being very colorful. I remember thinking Ukrainian somehow, those happy Easter colors that are so much about Ukrainian, that like the blue and yellow that we're seeing all over with what's happening in Ukraine. So all that makes perfect sense, but I don't think that she necessarily was thinking of a spot where the artists were, because that was a community where art was happening. You know, as art is happening where it's happening, but people were doing that all over the neighborhood. It was just invited that kind of spirit. It's sad that Gracie couldn't be here to talk about her direct experience with Carolyn.
I mean, we hope that this oral history around Caroline will just get more interesting and more complex as we move forward. Also on this Zoom call is Peter Acheson. Peter, are you comfortable speaking?
Sure. Am I muted, or am I?
No, we can hear you. And Peter, I if you'd like to introduce yourself, and then I believe you have, as far as we know, the largest holding of Caroline Go's work. So maybe you could speak to your experience.
I guess it was the early 80s. I lived on Lafayette Street between Bleecker and Houston. And Chris Martin, my pal, lived in 302 Mott Street. So we used to meet once a week on the weekend and walk up Lafayette and go to 103 Second Avenue or the Veselka. Those were our breakfast places. And we'd cross Cooper Square. And then that's where we met Caroline. And I don't know if she told me this or she told it to Chris, but in my recollection, this following story was she came from her, that she had been working as a hospice a nurse, or maybe not a nurse is the right word, but a hospice person, and that she made a painting of a woman that was in her care who died. And when the family came to the hospital to deal with it, Caroline gave them the painting, and they were very moved. And I always thought in my mind, I may have fabricated this a little bit, but I tend not to think so, that encouraged her, that she saw a direct kind of social function of art to, communicate, or to, she had made a painting of this woman who died because she was just sitting there all night, holding her hand more or less. And so I love that story. And I just a couple of times when you were speaking about her conversation, I remember asking her about certain images. I remember I had a painting of hers of a guy, he looked like a pharaoh or a Moses character on a chariot and with the sun. And I said, Caroline, what is this? What's going on here? And often I would get responses from her by saying, what's this one? So in that particular one, I remember she very seriously sort of, in a serious tone of voice, sort of lowered her eyes and said, oh, that was in the olden times. And I got a sense in some of the images of the paintings that I bought. I remember one of a guy releasing a turtle into a stream. And as we all know, who owned her work, she worked kind of thematically. And occasionally there'd be one that wasn't sort of one of, it would be a kind of a one-off. And this guy with the turtle, I said, what's going on here? And she said something about the turtle has to live in the stream. And I just got the impression that she would watch TV and perhaps had been watching a nature program, and just a really porous spontaneity about subject matter. Like if she happened to be watching a PBS thing on turtles, turtles would come into the work. And another thing I'd like to point out, I talked about this with Chris not too recently, but we remembered it rather recently because of the show at the gallery, which we both really enjoyed. And that was when we first met Caroline. As we know, it was the early 80s. And Chris and I had come to art as strict, sort of puritanical abstract painters. And all of a sudden, not only in the East Village, but artists like Susan Rothenberg and several of the painters of the late 70s were going back to a form of narrative. And, and then with the emergence on the scene of Julian Schnabel, Chris and I were big fans of the plate paintings. And to go from sort of Mary Boone plate painting Schnabel to Cooper Square, Caroline Go, it was absolutely seamless. It was a direct, rather mythological kind of fantasy sort of interaction with narrative that we could barely relate to. We were like, wait a minute, the subject matters, but it was also the imagination of making the thing up. And I remember just marveling at the way Julian would paint a face on a bunch of broken plates, and from a certain distance, it would be just masterfully painted. You could see the nose, you could see the shadow, you could see the mouth. And then in Caroline's case, she would paint a tiny, tiny face on a figure on the scrap of canvas. And you just didn't know how she crammed all that detail into this like kind of amazing image. And the whole thing was about a 1/2 inch square. but it was made out of paint. That's what impressed us. It was in the way the Julians were sort of interrupted by the broken plates, and Caroline's were interrupted by the fracture of the paint. And we'd look into the paint and go, wait a minute, I'm seeing a face in here. Check this out. And, so for us, I don't think we're too occupied with the category of what kind of work it was. I think we just saw kind of masterful painting. And the irony of, Julian at Mary Boone, king of the art world, and Caroline go, $1 each on Cooper Square. It didn't seem like an injustice. It just seemed like, you can find genius anywhere. And it was so inspiring. We both collected a lot. And just for my last, I'll just end by saying, I think I own 2 of the only sculptures Caroline ever did. I bought these for $5 one weekend. She had 2 of them. And what it is, if you can see, it's a lump of plaster with a face on it. This one's Moses and the other one I have is Moses with the tablets. So as far as I know, these are, really true collector's items, but we don't know. Maybe there are more out there. In any event, she was just wonderful. And I got the impression that she lived in a building that had a couple of artists in the building who would throw their paintings out, or she would find paintings on the street, cut them up. And so just by way of ending, it's here she was, perhaps not school trained as an art student, but absolutely efficient in the sort of sense of hunting and gathering, so that what other people threw out, an average size art student painting 2 by 3 feet would give her, I don't know, 20 canvases, 20, so it was just a beautiful, beautiful lesson. And then, like we've all noticed, she suddenly wasn't there. And I always thought that she'd turn up again. I would think she was going to turn up again in a different place on the street in New York. I've waited, 40 years or, 44 years or something, but now she's turned up again. So it's wonderful.
Like Curtis Coffey, she came back.
Came back, yeah. Anyway, wonderful, wonderful painter. I'm so happy that, she's getting the exposure and that, we're meeting because of her work. It's awesome.
Thanks, Peter. I think, unfortunately, we've hit the hour that we were allocated, and we hope that this is will be an ongoing conversation, not just among the people who spent time with Caroline and supported and collected her work, but I think as a wider audience appears around her practice, it's only going to get increasingly more interesting. So I'd really like to thank Lynne and Agosto, not only for your pioneering support of Caroline's work, but for being so generous to share the works you have with us through White Columns and Gordon Robichaux. I'd obviously like to thank Sam and Jacob at Gordon Robichaux for hosting this afternoon's conversation, which I believe has been recorded. And obviously then we would also like to extend that thanks to everybody who took part or was present for this conversation. And we look forward to future conversations going forward. The exhibition at Gordon Robichaux runs through June the 25th. If you haven't had a chance to see it, if you're in New York City, please do. There's great documentation of it online if you're tuning in from somewhere else. And on behalf of myself and White Columns, I'd like to say thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.